So, this firefight, it was... Just let me check the calendar. 8 days ago?
Yeah, day of the NATO invasion. After the flashpoint on Stratus, there was chaos. Nobody seemed to know what to do. Finally, NATO got their act together, launched an assault on the Altus mainland.
And CSAT?
Caught off guard by the whole thing. They were there to fight guerrillas, not start World War III. So when CSAT dropped their support, government forces panicked. They were on the back foot. Needed to regroup. Major Gavras was put in charge, but it was a tall order. Gavras tried to fortify their position in the northwest, but it was a risk, and he ended up cut off. The guerrillas, they didn't hesitate, stormed its position, sent the survivors running.
Okay, and if you don't mind me asking, how did you come to hear this?
Kostas Dimitri, a lieutenant, and the major's adjutant. Along with Gavras, the two of them were trying to make it to a helipack.
Move 200 meters, front.
You say they were trying to make it.
Mm-hmm. NATO took it out.
How?
Tank buster. At that point, they had air supremacy. Caught it on the hop.
Did they have another plan?
Not exactly, but they decided to make a stand at the church.
Helicopter, 200 meters, right. Move to the church.
And the major, what sort of a man was he? Was he respected?
Yeah, I mean, his reputation wasn't bloodied in the Civil War. Gavras was his own man, knew when to follow orders and when to adapt them.
Not the type to violate LOAC, then?
Well, that's a gray area. In the course of the firefight, the major used a mine dispenser. You can think of it like a portable minefield. This thing throws 14 mines as much as 50 feet, spread out across a wide arc of fire in front of it.
And they're designed to maim, rather than kill.
Yeah, but don't get me wrong. They can still be lethal. The major ordered Kostas to place mines too. Alexis, alongside a bunch of guerrillas, they were approaching from the north. At the same time, a NATO squad was moving in on their position. They'd been outnumbered 10-1. Like it or not, these mines represented their best, maybe only way of making it out.
Helicopter, 400 meters, northwest.
They scattered the mines and sat tight, waiting for the enemy. Facing those kind of odds, it was the only thing they could do.
Area clear. Contact, soldier!
Gavras fought bravely. Down.
Soldier, 75 meters, back! Rifleman, 75 meters, right! Fuck! Man down! Fire at that soldier! He's hit! Fuck, man down!
And Alexis, he took part in the fight.
Yep, you've been in the thick of it. Finally, the message came. A second helo was inbound.
They dispatched another.
Major Gavras was important, worth the risk. Of course, High Command had dead. I doubt they'd have come for Kostas if they'd known as much.
And Kostas, did he have to get to a new landing zone, or...?
Yeah, and quickly, before reinforcements turned up and cut him off. Loads of guys got injured. The mines, they'd, done their job.
I've covered countless conflicts. A capacity to hurt one another. It never fails to surprise. Do you think the Major's death had any impact on the war?
It's hard to tell. A lot of experienced officers died that day. Had he lived, he may have filled the gap. But let's face it, once CSAT pulled out, the Altus armed forces were through. The whole thing was over as soon as it had begun.
Despite the NATO invasion being a disaster?
Sure, that only held it back for so long. In the end, 3 days of fighting, that's all it took. But the human cost, the lasting damage, well, that's another thing altogether.
And Kostas, how did your paths cross? I'm still a little unclear.
Oh, Lieutenant Dimitriou. He came to IDAP, to our camp. The AAF provided us with information on the mines. Guy was a wreck, but his training had kicked in. He documented the minefields. Well, as best he could. But for Marcos, it was already too late. He'd already found one. Poor bastard.
Did Kostas explain what happened to the others? Those wounded by the mines in the firefight?
No, he got out of there pretty quick from the sounds of it. Andy, though, my colleague here, he reckons some of them were rescued by a NATO response team.
Okay. You've mentioned Alexis was with the guerrillas. Do you know what became of him?
He was killed. Shot, I think. It's sad, honestly. Both their lives, they ended here. Just a few feet apart. Next to the church where they were probably baptized.
Honestly, Nathan, all this information, it's a godsend. You've given me loads to work with here.
It's nothing really.
Now, there's just one last question I'd like to ask you. It's subjective, so take your time.
Sure. Fire away.
In your opinion, who's most to blame for all the suffering in Orio Castro? NATO? The guerrillas? CSAT? The Altis Armed Forces? Or, I don't know, something else? Do you think the Major's death had any impact on the war, despite the NATO invasion being a disaster?
Maybe. Certainly the government had become frustrated with NATO and vice versa. But the others said they just didn't have the guts for it.
NATO's invasion of all
Couldn't do what needed to be done.
I don't know how they got it so wrong.
Finally, NATO got their act together, launched an assault on the Altis mainland. But the human cost? The lasting damage? Well, that's another thing altogether.
So, these leaflets, they were a warning to the town.
Yeah, they confirmed the offensive. Or maybe they were just sick of all the extra paperwork. These leaflets, they were dropped maybe a day before the fighting began.
These vehicles, I suppose all of them were taken without consent.
Well, yeah, given the circumstances. The owners couldn't exactly refuse. The guerrillas hoped to block the road by jamming it with vehicles.
Right, but that's the thing. Never mind theft being illegal. The laws of armed conflict prohibit such actions. Do you happen to remember it well? The airstrike, I mean.
Yeah. October 13th. Cluster bomb. Town was shook up pretty bad. The army just wasn't able to capture the place. And Colonel Arcanteros, he did not tolerate failure.
Right. And the evidence in the commission report, doesn't it point to CSAT?
Yeah. But truth can be the first casualty of war. They scattered the mines and sat tight, waiting for the enemy. Facing those kind of odds, it was the only thing they could do. I guess it made sense for them to target the point of entry. Choke points, you know? The graveyard, it would have made for quite a kill zone.
You've seen things from both sides. I mean, now as an NGO, too.
I've seen a few things, heard stories. You gotta remember it was pretty chaotic back then. All those competing factions, people just disappeared in that kind of chaos.
You had to be impartial.
Precisely. In a conflict, we have to remain neutral, a partner to all parties, even those that personally we may object to. My mind, you know, sometimes it just kind of wanders.
I've covered countless conflicts.
This town,
A capacity to hurt one
it's
another.
no stranger to
It
war.
never fails to surprise.
Man's inhumanity. It's really something. They scattered the mines and sat tight, waiting for the enemy. Facing those kind of odds, it was the only thing they could do. I'd have to say the Altis Armed Forces. I mean, they wanted to wipe Orio Castro off the map, to make an example of it, you know? It's one thing fighting against a resistance. It's another to make the civilian population pay for it. I don't know. As they clung on to power, they wound up scarring the very country they'd pledged to protect. And the folks here in Orio Castro, they're the ones that have suffered. They're the ones left to face the remnants of war.
I'd still leave with the statistic, Kate. That's your hope.
Okay. I'm using the mind as a metaphor now. Buried and forgotten. Thoughts?
Sounds legit. I cut that sentence on the scars, though. Sounds too anatomical. Show, don't tell, remember?
Right. And here, US Marine Corps, not USMC?
Marine Corps. And our angle?
Last paragraph. I moved it down a bit. Figured you'd want to conclude on that.
No sword of Damocles, please. Remember, we're creating a space, defining the boundaries. Let our readers fill the gaps. Perfect. Think about the pull quotes. I'll be back in 10. Gotta tell Bartleby his story's spiked.
Thanks, Guy.